Hey guys, this is Mecrow here. I wanted to do a video about optimizing Throne and Liberty and talk about the stats that are involved with this game. It's a really interesting topic that a lot of people have looked at, and I don't think anyone's really given a great answer on how to optimize things. I've seen some people, like Eli, do a pretty good job with videos, as well as showing how to test stats and like a general consensus of what is good. I've seen other people, like Whelps, and a few others kind of just go through build guides and are like, oh, this build has these stats, so you need to hit this threshold, and everyone takes that threshold as like the word of God or something, and like doesn't really understand what's going on behind the scenes. So my attempt for this video is to kind of break that down into a little bit more of an understandable format and kind of help people figure out what stats are best for them and how stats themselves kind of intertwine with this game and form their own metas, so to speak. So to start off here, there's three main kind of stats I want to be talking about in this video today. Uh, those are in particular, we have player versus player scaled stats. So those are things like you have PvP basically going on within your stats. So hit chance is like the opposite of evasion, right? Like you need to have hit chance to hit someone. If someone has too high of an evasion, you won't hit them. So these two kind of work to get against each other. You have player only scaled stats. These are things like defense and like your base damage values, which cannot be manipulated in really any way. There's like additives to these, but these stats are kind of the base of everything, and that's why like your level of your gear matters so much, especially for your weapons, and why a lot of people have suggested when T2 comes out and within the next 2 weeks that you really need to make sure that you get your weapons up first, because that's like the basis of how everything is calculated. So if you have under-leveled weapons, it's really going to hurt you, and in a lot of cases a max level T1 weapon will be better than like kind of a mid-level T2 weapon, just because of like this fact. And then lastly, we have player only non-scaled stats. These are kind of niche, but in particular, buff duration and debuff duration appear to not have some sort of self-balancing scalar factor that I want to talk about. What I mean by this is if you look at this graph, which is an example of how stats work in Eternal Liberty in general, where they kind of start off at a certain point and you progress really, really fast to a high percentage. If you see that percentage there, like this is 40% at 700. If you look at double 700, I'm only at 58, right? So it's like they tend to fall off and taper at a certain point. Buff duration and debuff duration don't appear to have that. It is a stat that's like, those two stats are a little bit harder to test in game, but if you look at the tooltips as well, you don't see any mention of anything here that is going to be kind of counting against you, versus if you look at a cooldown speed, if you look under at the bottom there, you can see how the cooldown's actually less of a percentage, and that shows us like that kind of power of scaling, but cooldown speed is one that's not really affected by the enemy, so it's like that second category of stats, or it's like player only non-scaled stats. If that's like a lot of words for you and it doesn't really make sense, basically you need to have a very large amount of stats above your opponent for stuff to work. But if you have too large of stats compared to your opponent, then nothing really matters. Like you want more stats to a point, and once you hit that point, it's kind of pointless to go further, if that makes sense. So a lot of the game is figuring out what matchups you're looking for, like from a high level PvP perspective. It's think of the matchups that you're looking for, think of what stats the builds that you're trying to play against tend to have, what builds that are trying to play into you have, and figure out ways to manipulate stuff ever so slightly to give yourself an advantage. And that has to be done through a lot of research, which you see from people like Whelps, as well as just kind of like a basic understanding of what goes on behind the scenes. So most of these stats, if you look at them, you'll see that they have a thing in the tooltip where it says for every 10 points of difference, increase the chance by about 1%. As the difference increases, the efficiency decreases. From a math standpoint, what that means is that you're just dividing by 1,000. And what that means from a number standpoint, if you just don't think about the math at all, is if you want 50% more of any stat that says 1% in game, you need to have 1,000 more than your opponent. So if I want a 50% chance to evade any attack that's incoming, I need to have 1,000 more evasion than the person that's trying to hit me. And there's some other kind of thresholds that we could talk about too, but I think generally the 50% threshold is like something that people tend to look at. I think the 33% chance is also a decent one to look at, and that's like at about 500, but a little bit less than 500. And then everything in the middle is like, we don't really care as much because those are the two big easy numbers to look at. If you're going above 50%, you need so much of like a stat advantage to the point where it's like not really worth talking about. But some kind of important things in terms of like what this number actually is, like that 1,000 number for certain things that isn't talked about in game. For the defense values, that value is 2,750. So if I have 2,750 defense, I will take 50% less damage. That was a little bit weird to figure out, but that was something I was kind of figuring out to optimize Templar builds, and why for my build for T1, I run a lot of melee defense to help counter spear, but I don't necessarily run a ton of melee endurance, because spear just has a way to strip your endurance anyway. So I was like, what the heck, why do I even care about the endurance towards this class? No other melee is really going to be hitting me as a Templar, so I'm just going to stack my melee defense. There's like little things like that that you can kind of manipulate, especially with the T2 builds. That being said, the thing that's made the game, I think, a lot simpler from an optimization standpoint recently is they introduced this new stat called Fortitude. The stats in general, they have a tooltip here that gives a description of each stat, so I don't want to go through them all. But Fortitude's basically your tankiness stat, and any gear piece that has Fortitude comes at a premium. And there is only like one set in T2 that's out so far that has the Fortitude stat. So everybody's been talking about T2 builds and like, oh my god, there's Nebula X or accessories that we're probably not going to be able to get. There's these crazy gear pieces, but at the end of the day, basically everybody in terms of Nebula is like looking at somewhere between 2 to 4 piece Vanguard, just because this has Fortitude and because Fortitude is like so and so insane. So most of the optimization got a lot simpler, but from a base perspective, when we actually go through all these stats here, your melee hit chance, like that's contrast to melee evasion, right? If you have more hit chance than the evasion, you're going to be hitting every attack. If the person has more evasion than hit chance, which the game is designed for you to typically have more evasion than hits chance, so stuff actually has a chance to hit and won't hit all the time. You're not actually like, from a build perspective, for the most part, you're not expecting to actually get more hit than people can stack evasion towards a specific stat, because at that point, like, evasion's completely useless, and if you're putting that much hit into something, for a lot of weapons, it's just not optimal from a DPS outpoint perspective. So usually you want to get to a point where you're able to hit like, 66, 70% of your hits, maybe even like 50 for some classes. It just depends on like what you're building towards, and you don't really need to worry about hit beyond that point. There's some math stuff that I can get into a different video if people are interested about optimizing that. But for certain weapons that are multi-hits, high hit chance is actually detrimental at a certain point because there's better ways to optimize damage. Critical hit chance is contrasted to endurance. The interesting part about these is I don't think critical hit chance or endurance are very intuitive to understand until you look at this base weapon damage. And this looks weird to anyone that's not really kind of dove into the game statistics, but you know how it says 199 to 315 in this example with Nirma? If I crit, I'm doing 315. If someone has too much endurance and their endurance protection procs, I'm doing 199. Otherwise, I'm somewhere random in the middle. So for weapons with a large spread between high and low base damage, so if I were to, say, look at an Expo, for example, like this is 39 to 156, right? So like 4 times 39 is 160. So it's like crit chance is really, really, really important on Expo because there's a very large variance between the minimum and maximum damage. Just like that, if you have a ton of endurance, Expo does nothing. So what do most Expos build around? They build around hit chance. Like that is their most important stat to hit. It's not heavy attack, it's hit chance. Like not hit chance, critical hit chance. Like if you don't have that, you're basically doing 0 damage. So would you rather be able to hit like all of your attacks, or would you rather be able to deal 4 times damage, right? Like if I'm hitting 50% of the attacks, but I'm doing 4 times damage consistently, I'm going to net more damage than someone that's going for maximum hit. So there's like little interactions like that that kind of get interesting with that stat in particular. Then going down the list here, we got heavy attack chance. This is basically a chance to hit twice. Heavy attack evasion is a chance to evade the heavy attack that's incoming. I think heavy attack evasion in general is a little bit overrated, but if you look at the actual tooltip here, it's like it's a for every 10 it increases by 1%, right? But this is like really hard to come by. What this basically means is you're not going to be hitting every single heavy attack. In T2, that does change a bit. I believe Greatsword could hit like 1,000 heavy attack pretty consistently. So basically Greatsword has a 50% chance to hit twice, right? So it's like important to have some resistance there, but you don't want to like go overboard per se. Like if I have 750 total evasion versus someone with a 100 or with a 1,000 hit chance, like that's gonna net being somewhere like relatively low in terms of the damage that's incoming, to the point where it's not really worth it. So if I had like, if there's a difference of 250, right, they're gonna be hitting 23% of the time. Say there's a difference of 500, like now they're hitting 33% of the time. Like in 250 is like a crap ton of stats. So it's like it matters to build in this stuff from a defensive standpoint to a point, but if you overdo it, like you're basically just wasting stats that can be put elsewhere. Which I think is like kind of the interesting part about Throne and Liberty conceptually from a defense perspective, is compared to other games I've played, typically from a defense perspective, you want to go all in on one defensive stat, versus in this game, if you go all in on one defensive stat and someone isn't using that thing that you're going for, you're going to have to sacrifice a lot of something else. So for the most part, you're looking to build something that's really well-rounded, and then you're looking to tech to one or two meta builds that can soft counter your build. For example, for me, as a Templar, the things that counter me right now, because the game is slightly bugged, is that there are weakens that are incoming from Fire Staff that are heal cuts. Those heal cuts reduce the amount that I could heal myself, which basically means that my survivability just tanks and just does not exist. So a lot of stuff is built around either debuff duration reduction, which will reduce the duration of the heal cut, or you have weaken resistance, which will prevent weakens from even coming through, and a heal cut is technically part of that weakened class. So that's how, like, that's that interaction. We have skill damage boost. This is another thing that's about, like, for every 10 points, it increases it by about 1%. This is a kind of an overrated stat in my opinion, but it is widely used by everybody. It's important to have it, but you don't, like, it's another one of those things where it's like heavy attack evasion, where it's like you don't necessarily want to overdo it, but it's a little bit better than heavy attack stuff because everything is a skill. So this is like a little bit more important to have than heavy attack evasion, in my opinion. We have bonus damage, which is just a flat damage increase to the base damage here. There's damage reduction, which is just a flat damage decrease in the damage that's incoming. Both of these are good for multi-hit weapons in particular, so like Expo is like one thing that comes to mind. Critical damage is if we crit, how much extra damage do we deal? Critical damage reduction is if we crit, how much extra damage is reduced up to the point of the maximum value of a crit. So if I crit, I'm hitting 315, right? And then it's getting multiplied by 14% or 114% if you want to be technical. And then that's being like, basically this like is getting reduced, but I can't ever go below 315 because that would be below what a standard crit was. So crit damage reduction is something that I think a lot of Templars were looking at one point for tier 2. In particular, there are a lot of people that were really confused from a new mastery perk, which I open up mine, that I kind of built out. There was a thing called Second Wind, and this was bugged when the game first came out, and it basically gave you over 100% crit damage reduction, and people were like, oh, do I even need to run Endurance if I have crit damage reduction? It's like, yes. They're going to be hitting 315 every single time in that case of that Nirma, and that's still going to be hurting. It's just, instead of hitting for like 350, it'd be hitting for 315. But like, we care more about like min-maxing those, or like getting the low rolls on there than just like reducing damage after they crit, if that makes sense. So like, crit damage resistance is like, it's a nice to have stat, and a lot of people force a ton of it, but honestly, it's not, from a math standpoint, it's not one of the better stats that you can get, and it's honestly something that people probably could be looking to cut a little bit more of, just because if you have enough endurance, it doesn't matter. If you don't have a lot of endurance, it's nice, but most people don't have a ton of crit damage out of effects, so it's not something you have to like really sell out to stop, if that makes sense. All right, finishing up here, we have buff duration. This is one of those that doesn't seem to have some sort of scalar value, so buff duration is actually like incredibly powerful. I'd argue buff duration and debuff duration from a stat perspective are probably the most important stats in the game, which I'm not stacking a ton of these right now, but with T2, you can get 100% uptime on certain buffs with buff duration being stacked and with a good amount of cooldown reduction. The main thing about buff duration is it doesn't seem to have that fall off mechanic that cooldown speed has, right? Where you see the 16% here and it says actually that's like 13% because we're going to scale that. Buff duration doesn't seem to have that, so it's strong, and same with debuff duration. And then there's shield block penetration chance. When you block with the shield, you reduce your damage that's incoming by 50%. It says it blocks like all other CC effects from weaken, but we've seen instances of abilities kind of go through that, and I don't know if that's a bug state or if it's like supposed to be blocking those, but in theory, shield block chance is also kind of insane, so you can take penetration to kind of counter that. Shield block chance in T2 for a lot of defensive classes can get upwards of like 90 to 95%, so it's basically every single person with an SNS is going to be reducing the damage that's incoming by 50% almost all the time. And everyone else is like whenever you're blocking or reducing the damage that's incoming by a certain amount. I don't know if that's 50% or not, something I haven't been able to test, but it's kind of interesting. And then the other noteworthy thing is a lot of these stuff that I said is like in particular to doing damage. So if you look at like Eli stuff, which Eli is arguably the best or like one of the best healers in the game, a lot of his math that's on his site where he talks about buffs is actually based off of healing stats. It isn't exactly correct. So if I look at this formula here with this 3000, I looked at the math because I reached out to Eli and he provided me the math for that, and this is correct for healer, but if you actually look at the math for damage, it's 1000. So basically skill damage doesn't matter as much for healer. It's 1/3 of the effectiveness as any other class, but that kind of makes sense, right? Because healer has no stat working against them, so it should just inherently be harder to get value out of it. That's how that was balanced in Throne of Liberty. I think everything else here is not as important to talk about, like health regen, mana regen, stamina regen. Cooldown speed's a kind of a weird one where there's no counter to it, but it scales and falls off at a certain point. You could think of cooldown speed as basically looking at this graph that I've been showing, but you just have no counter to it available. So it's like if I had 1000 cooldown speed, that would be, or 1000 in the back end, 1000, it would be 50%. I guess it doesn't show that in the game itself, but it's something that would be calculated to behave in that same fashion, if that makes sense. So if you want to see the effectiveness of cooldown speed though, like honestly, it's like pretty easy just to plug it into a quest log and then just come over here and then look at cooldown speed, and then you just see where your stats end up at, right? So it's like if you were to take off everything, put on one piece of cooldown speed, then you could see like what the effective like fall off at a certain point. So it says like 68.8 or 36.8%, but then in the parentheses it's like 26.9. So it's like there's actually a fair bit of fall off there, which you don't see with buff duration, which is why buff duration is like relatively good. And then with CC effects, these are all a little bit different because instead of having that 1%, it says 4%. What this effectively means from a math standpoint is that your difference between your CC effects and your stats on that matter a lot more. So if I was like looking at this before, right, like my 50% was at 1000. Now it's like if someone wants 50% of the chance to resist a collision that's incoming, you need to have 250 more than the person that's going to be attacking you. And with like Greatsword, for example, they are naturally going to be closer to like over 1,100 collision chance or something stupid like that if they want it in T2. So it's like you need to have basically 1,500 collision resistance to even have a chance of something being evaded or like being resisted. So it's like if you're going to stack that much, you're basically sacrificing so many things from your build that it doesn't make sense for a lot of people to run it. So like for classes that it made sense to run collision res in T1, it might not make sense in T2 because the values of collision chances get so unbelievably high. The downside to this is that a lot of the cooldown skills are on a very low CDR. So if I were to look at Rake, for example, and this is maxed out with cooldown reduction, I believe this is a 21-second cooldown before you actually have any cooldown reduction on here. I think I can confirm that within here, but it's Yeah, 21 second at level 15, and then that's further reduced by a passive that some people take when they take rate called morale boost. So it's like people that are going to be looking to do collision stuff in T2 are going to be colliding with people a lot, and there's not a ton that you can do about it unless you basically overstack collision resistance. So that's like one ramification of this stat in particular scaling by a 4-to-1 ratio of a normal stat, right? Is every single point in here matters a lot more. So like with weaken chance, that matters a lot more. So that's why I'm consistently able to hit all my weakens on this version of the build, but then some other people that don't build out weaken chances, like a Templar, can't do that. So it's like, this is like kind of the spot where I think people underestimate the value of certain stats like this. So like weaken chance, weaken resistance is like secretly really, really important. Same with stun chance, stun resistance. Same with collision chance, collision resistance. Some of these other ones are not really used as much. So like sleeps, for example, like you can build out sleep resistance if you want to counter that, or you can build out like weaken resistance because weakens are a type of sleep. So it doesn't, like, both of these are a factor for actually hitting something, but it doesn't make sense to like always go into one or the other. But if you want to hard counter like one particular thing that's incoming that's bothering you, like most people won't be building out, for example, fear chance. So if you had like fear resistance, you'd be able to counter that a little bit more easily. So that's something that's like, if you want a tech option to counter a particular stat, this is like a really, really good way to do that. So I hope that was helpful for understanding stats at like kind of a base level. Let me know if things are confusing from a like kind of do you want to stack a certain stat to a certain point standpoint. But I just wanted to kind of go through a high level overview on in terms of how stats interact with each other, what thresholds you're really looking to hit, which in general, it does follow this article here, and this is actually does a really good job illustrating it, where it's like, if you have 500 more of a stat, the effectiveness is 33%. If you have 1,000 more, it's 50%, and then after that, it tends to fall off really, really hard, so it doesn't really make sense to get behind or beyond this 500 to 1,000 range above in any single stat that you're looking for. And with that being said, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.